me start by introducing our panel. And by the way, we're going to keep this, since we don't have much time, we'll just try and keep it brisk and active, and we'll save a few minutes at the end for questions. But if you have a burning question, if you want to maybe even contradict something that you hear set up here, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll try and get you in the conversation. Starting with Jean Su. Jean is the president and a producer of Broadvision Entertainment. Her background earlier in her career was as an executive search consultant. She was the first executive search consultant in China and built up the operations of Korn Ferry in mainland China. Now she's producing movies and TV in partnership with her husband, which I think is a very interesting thing that we could probably cover a whole panel on that topic alone. But she's got movies in production, has raised capital here, has a focus really more on outside of China with your productions, which I'll be interested to ask you about. Jean's a graduate of Beijing's University of International Business and Economics, and she also holds master's degrees from MIT and also from UCLA, where she studied in the professional producing program. Next to Jean is Tom McGrath. He's the COO of production and distribution company STX, which, if you know about that, is one of the very prominent examples of successful collaboration between Chinese partners and American partners. They're focused on producing films and for international distribution. Tom has, the partners, by the way, are Honey Capital and Huai Brothers, the Chinese partners in the venture. You also partnered with TPG Growth as one of your major investors. Tom has a background as an investor in Broadway theater, in the music business. He has had a long career as a studio executive in production and distribution. He was one of the major forces behind building multiplexes around the world and really modernizing the cinema exhibition business. I think you had a hand in the transition to digital, which was really a major transition for and not an easy one for the movie business. Tom started his career as a musician, performing in a Washington, D.C. based orchestra, and he's a graduate of Harvard College and also Harvard Business School. Can everyone hear me okay? I just want to make sure. Oh, okay. Let me bring the mic a little closer. And then next to me, Chris Fenton is the president of DMG Entertainment Motion Picture Group and also the GM of DMG's North American operations. He was a motion picture agent earlier in his career at William Morris Agency. And then in 2002, is that right? You started at DMG? Yeah. Wow, that's really a pioneer in the China U.S. entertainment business. He runs the North American operations, as I said. He's been involved in a diverse range of businesses at DMG, from advertising, endorsements, sponsorship, talent management, music publishing, education, and also film production, which is mainly what we'll focus on today. He's led DMG's successful partnerships with Hollywood studios and production companies, and has had a major role in movies like Looper, 47 Ronin, Transcendence, Iron Man, and has other films coming up. Chris earned his degree in engineering at Cornell University. And then next to Chris, Mike Gabrawy is the Chief Creative Officer at Arclight Films, which many people think of as primarily as a foreign and international sales company, but they're also very active in production and have very deep ties in China and a long background there. Mike shepherded movies like Bait 3D, which I'd like to talk about. I think that's a really interesting one for its success in China, and has several other movies going there, which he can tell us about. Mike previously worked at the German production company Constantine. He was an executive on the Resident Evil films, and he's worked on other such diverse movies as Waterworld, Stargate, and Independence Day. And he's a graduate of the Film Studies program at the University of Kansas. So if I've left anything important out that you'd like to talk about, please mention it. I'm going to start with a couple questions just to get things rolling. The first one is just, if we could go across the panel and everybody tell us about your involvement in China, what you have going on there, and how you expect that's going to change in the coming years.
Should I start?
Yes, please.
My involvement, myself, born and grew up in China. About 17 years ago, moved to Silicon Valley, and 5 years ago, moved to Napa Valley because after the crash, my husband and I decided we need to find somewhere close where we can live a good life, at the same time close to Silicon Valley where we have our clients in the executive search world. And after we landed in Napa Valley, which I call it heaven on earth, you start to become very creative. And the first Napa Film Festival, my husband wrote a couple of, it's a pitch contest. And we didn't even know what the pitch contest is, but it turned out it's Hollywood executives went to Napa Film Festival looking for stories. So in the pitch contest, he won 2 of his stories, both came in first. And when the executives wanted to read the scripts, and he said, I don't have a script because I don't know how to write it. So from that point on, 3 years ago, he moved to, he actually started going to UCLA, going to film school, and started to write scripts. And today, there are, in our company, we've got about a dozen scripts and 5 TV shows. And surprisingly, most of our scripts always have an Asian female lead, a strong female lead, which I think right now the market is ready for a strong Asian female lead. And myself is also co-creator of some of the shows. That's what I'm here. I moved to LA last year so that we can get these scripts and TV shows into production. That's where I am. Tom?
Okay, so STX is a new film production and distribution company, which was started by Robert Simons and TPG Growth, a division of TPG Capital. Our involvement in China begins with one of our major shareholders, Hony Capital, which is a private equity fund based in Beijing and Shanghai. And after the formation of the company, we entered into an umbrella slate financing agreement with Huayi Brothers Entertainment, where they take a stake in all of our productions and then manage the Chinese distribution of our films. As part of this overall strategy, we've entered into development agreements with a number of Chinese production companies for potential co-productions, including, among other things, Jackie Chan's next movie, The Foreigner. As time progresses, we expect the Chinese market to play a larger role in the development of the film business generally and our company. Prior to that, however, I also had a variety of other involvements in China, including building one of the first multiplex theaters in Dalian, well before the multiplex building boom, and not to mention countless years with the Motion Picture Association lobbying for increasing the film quota, something I finally just gave up on. So.
Thanks, Tom. Before Chris introduces himself, I just wanted to mention that China is undergoing just a massive boom in its film business these days. This month, it will gross about 5.5 billion RMB at the movie theaters, which is almost $900 million. Just to give you some perspective, in 2009, the entire year, China grossed about $900 million. So things are really taking off. There's a film now, Monster Hunt, which has set a new record for the highest gross of a Chinese film. It looks like it's going to hit around $300 million just in China. So it's an exciting time right now. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Yeah, I'll make it quick, but I'll first say that I've done a bunch of these panels, but this group of people is actually very distinguished because they've all, in different capacities, actually accomplished things in the China market. For the most part, people do a lot of talking about it and announce things, but they never actually close deals or actually create successes. In fact, the Bait 3D one is one of my favorites that I like to tell after a couple of cocktails. I'm hoping my version of the story lines up with the truth. But anyway, I'm the GM of North America and the motion picture head for DMG Entertainment. We like to refer to ourselves as China's first global entertainment content and media company. We've also pride ourselves on being in the technology business too, especially after our recent announcement with Alibaba on an OTT service in the Hunan province last month. We have our Chinese operation trading publicly on the Shenzhen exchange. Our shares have actually been relatively on a nice sort of Prozac run during this very volatile broader market run. We've actually kept our shares trading the whole time too, because we believe in what our company is, and I think shareholders and investors believe in it too. You asked where I think the China market's going. Just briefly, I can say that personally I've invested my career into where China is going, and I believe that it's probably one of the smarter bets I've made in my life.
That was very flattering. I kind of want to echo the same thing, in that I think it's an amazing panel, and thank you all for including me. I work for Arclight. Arclight is as Robert said, primarily a foreign sales company. But about 7 years ago, I joined the company to help ramp up the production side of the company. Same time, about 10 years ago, we started an Asian division called Eastern Light, which was designed to sell Chinese language films, Asian films, to the world market outside of China. It was just kind of a coincidental, happy accident that ended up kind of helping us build what is now the most important division of our company. 70% of my production slate are now Chinese films or Chinese co-productions. Arclight's originally an Australian company, and as to where we're going, I think it's only going to grow more. I think we're at this tipping point right now, like Robert said, of and Chris also said this, from a box office standpoint, we're at the tipping point where China's the most important territory in the world. And if you look at 10 years ago, it was really the US with Europe driving the market side of the industry, and now I see that as China, and beyond China, Southeast Asia. So what we've done at Arclight is, fortunately, we built these relationships with producers and filmmakers in China, but also throughout the rest of Southeast Asia, which shouldn't be discounted. The way that we drove the international market, I say the US, I see the next 10 to 20 years being China driving the Southeast Asian market. And with Europe contracting more and more, and places like Germany that underpinned a lot of our financing on these independent films, buying fewer and fewer films, and the US buying fewer and fewer films, all of a sudden now we're relying even more so on China to drive the market side of our business, which is the kind of main part. So.
Thanks, Mike. I'd like to ask each of the panelists to talk briefly about a deal that you've put together between a Chinese company and an American company. There are a lot of challenges, obviously, beyond just language and culture and putting deals together. And so starting with Mike, maybe you can tell us.
Sure. I mean, Chris mentioned Bait, which is pretty funny in that it was, I think, an advantage that we have is, and this is in no way to kind of discount the way Hollywood operates, but we're an Australian company, so everything that we do, we kind of come at from a kind of a smaller, from an international perspective. So most of my films are built out of either Australia or Canada as the kind of Western core, and then we do co-productions with China. And I think China sees, they have a much longer historic economic tie to both Australia and China. So they see them as little brothers. They like Australia's rocks, they like, they like Canada's resources, so there's a lot more kind of transactional history there. So when we were doing a movie called Bait 3D that it started out, it was just a fun script, kind of a ridiculous concept of a tsunami that hits the Gold Coast of Australia, floods this shopping center with a pack of hungry tiger sharks, and all the survivors have to fend this off. It was at the time when 3D was exploding. The kind of first step, we were developing it with a director at the time by the name of Russell Mulcahy. At the time, 3D was starting to explode. Australia, was the dollar was lower, so it was helping us make what ended up being a $20+ million film with an enormous amount of subsidies. And then at that time, Singapore was also getting heavily involved in 3D and wanting to become the kind of 3D hub for Asia. So we ended up, they have a treaty between Australia and Singapore. We ended up building it as a treaty co-production between Singapore and kind of finding a way to work this construct. At the same time, and Chris may have heard other kind of components to this, we were trying to figure out how we build this as a Chinese co-production as well. And it was very early days. This is probably 5 or 6 years ago. There hadn't been a lot of Australian-Chinese co-productions. While that paperwork was going, we ended up engineering it to become also a Chinese co-production with Australia. It went on to become, you know, while the movie didn't do great business in the US or Australia, it went on to become the most successful independent film released in China at the time. So it did almost $30 million in the box office there. And I think I contribute, a big part of that is that the film grammar of China is not the same as ours. So they don't have, you know, Jaws in their lexicon of films. And the film was also released during a period where Chinese films were released. So it was kind of a Hollywood mashup, and we ended up doing very, very well because it was a popcorn movie released when there were a lot more kind of serious films in the box office at the time, or at the theaters at the time.
Thanks, Mike.
But how'd you make it, you made it relevant by what happens in the third act of the movie?
Well,
right?
we did we shot in China for about 5 weeks, and we wove, this was part of the process, but we wove a Chinese story into, there was a mention in one of the characters at the beginning that they were going off at the time to Singapore. That was kind of structured to be China, and then we ended up doing shooting for about 5 weeks in China. Not a lot of that ended up in the film, unfortunately, but it was this kind of organic, and it plays with what the film is, which is it's kind of a camp, fun action movie. So it has all the right scares, but it was kind of engineered, and you'll see it. I mean, I just did another film called Outcast last year that unfortunately I don't believe it was released the way it should have been in China, but it was Nick Cage and Hayden Christensen. And what we do when we're developing films is, producers or we will develop things internally that if there's something with a Chinese component. So this is about 2 soldiers coming out of the Crusades that that escape, go down the Silk Road and cross paths with a princess whose kingdom has been usurped. And it's trying to find these kind of, as organic as they can be, mashups between East and West. And it's kind of a road movie with Hayden Christensen and Crystal Liu and set in Yunnan and shot in the most beautiful locations. So, we look for ways to engineer things. So that's a case of, that was a Canadian-French-Chinese co-production. And again, from a business standpoint, if you construct it the right way, 75% of that budget came from 2 territories. It came from, again, a $20+ million film with 75% of the budget coming from Canada and China. So, but it was, shot entirely in China, but with Nicolas Cage, who has obviously has a market recognition, Hayden Christensen, who has a market recognition because of his studio tentpole films, and also he happens to be Canadian, so he helped us from a passport standpoint, from a qualification standpoint.
Great, yeah, thank you, Mike. I want to ask Chris also about putting together multi-territory deals. You've worked on some big movies with the Hollywood studios, and what's that been like? What have been some of the challenges, and how have you worked through those?
Well, there's a lot to cover in that question, but to try to simplify it as much as possible. I mean, what Mike is referring to is if you want something to work in China, you have to make it relevant to them, and there's 2 audiences you have to make your content relevant to, and that's the government and the consumers. And the government is essentially the gatekeeper to get you access to the consumers. So you have to make the relevancy to the government, allow them to understand why it's important for them to support your form of content. And in this case, we're talking about movies. That over time has sort of matured and developed with how we do it. If we go back to Looper, we actually created a plot in that film that involved China, it involved locations in China, and involved the engine that was driving Bruce Willis's character to seek revenge because it was a Chinese woman who he married who was killed. And it showcased China in a certain way. We actually worked with the Shanghai municipal government to design what they wanted their city to look like in the backdrop of various scenes 40 years in the future. You can progress towards Iron Man 3, where we shot limited footage in China, in fact, mainly second unit. Part of that was because Robert Downey Jr. got hurt during production and we were racing to finish the film. But the fact of the matter is we were creating relevancy that wasn't quite as dramatic on the plot, but involved China relevancy into the Marvel Universe itself. We actually created a character named Dr. Wu, and we actually implemented him into the Marvel Universe, starting at the beginning pre-Iron Man in the comics, and then leading through the beginning of Iron Man 3. So he actually had a storyline away from the actual movie itself so that fanboys would understand what was happening with this character and why he was in Iron Man 3 briefly, but also to allow the Chinese to feel a part of that Marvel universe. And it worked extremely well. We had a big challenge on our hands when Disney and Marvel approached us about it with an Iron Man 2 movie that made roughly $22 million in China, and a Marvel brand that didn't mean anything there, to when Iron Man 3 came out a few years back, we made $125 million. So it was a 5x difference, which was really important. Cut to today, now we're trying to be even more sensitive about the actual creative content. When it's warranted, we want to put China relevancy into the content itself. When it's not, we want to bring the relevancy to the table via our ability to co-finance, co-develop, co-produce, market, and distribute. Those 5 facets allow us as a Chinese studio to then be a part of the movie itself, which becomes a cross-Pacific collaboration and thusly more relevant to the China audience.
Yeah, Chris, you make some really good points about, and you're, of course, representing a Chinese company, but the American side of it. An important point for American companies is to, in dealing with China, really bring something to the table, treat your Chinese partners as equals, help them to achieve their goals. Very often, Tom, American companies here in Hollywood really just look at China as a source of capital and a market, and don't really think about their Chinese counterparts as equal partners. You've obviously been very successful with STX in developing some nice relationships there. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I think historically the major film studios in Hollywood are used to being the center of attention on a global basis, and as a consequence, in their initial dealings with the emerging Chinese film market, a great tendency to regard them as a junior player, a junior partner. Now, I think that attitude is shifting as the Chinese market becomes more important to them. But over the last few years, there's been a great deal of press and a lot of visits and photos of various Chinese dignitaries sitting at Lakers games and no actual deals being closed. And part of the reason is the tendency on the part of the very large companies to treat the Chinese partners as junior partners. I don't produce movies, so I'll talk a little bit about capital raising in China, which is really where I've gotten involved. And Honey Capital is a large private equity fund. I assume everyone here is familiar with private equity funds. And they made their investment in STX Entertainment, and 6 weeks later they bought Pizza Express in London. So typical sort of random private equity investing. What I found most interesting is the contrast in the last 2 years of my dealings in China with my dealings 20 years ago. I would say that the nature of the discussions, the detail, and the level of support required was identical to that would be required at any American private equity fund. I often felt that I was floating in some sort of strange international negotiating room, because I really didn't see a distinction between negotiating with Honey Capital and working with Carlyle or Blackstone or TPG or any of the other big funds. And I think one of the things that people need to take on board in raising capital in China is that you are dealing with people who are of comparable significance and comparable talent and knowledge as anybody that you've met in the US or England, and they are accustomed to being treated as though they don't have that knowledge base. And so people often come to the meetings unprepared, without the appropriate backup, thinking that they're just selling a story and not that they're going to have to support it at the level of detail that J.P. Morgan Bank would expect, for example. I can't overemphasize the importance of being introduced at the right level to these companies, and I can't overemphasize the importance of patience and spending time on the ground to build the relationships over time. When we made our approach to the Chinese investment funds, this was far from the first trip for any of us to China or our first experience in the marketplace. The partners from TPG had lived in China. We were using lawyers who were domestic in Shanghai and Beijing. We probably had half a dozen trips and meetings before we actually had any serious conversations about investment. And I think what you can't do is expect to have any kind of serious transaction at scale without investing a significant amount of time establishing your credentials, building a trust base with your partner, and documenting the case for your particular investment. Now, Honey is an equity investor in the company. They are a member of the board of directors, so they actually have oversight of the company. The other transaction that we've announced is the film investment with YE Brothers Entertainment. And YE is taking a stake in all of our films. They'll handle the Chinese rights. But the deal is not actually about producing films in China. And for that matter, most of the films we're producing right now could very well end up not being theatrically distributed in China. This was really a desire on the part of YE Brothers to become part of the global film business, more akin to Sony and its initial investment in Columbia Pictures and later acquisition. That deal was not about making movies in Japan. It was about Sony becoming a global player in film and entertainment. And YE's approach to this is that they want to be a global player in the industry and have an exposure to all the markets in the world. And I think most of their other conversations in Hollywood had simply been about, if I make a movie in China, how much money will you give me? And that was really not their goal. And so understanding the goal of your counterparty is central to whether or not you'll successfully conclude a transaction.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Tom. Thank you. Gene, I'd like to ask you a different question. You're, as the one panelist here who's a native of China and a native speaker and immersed in the culture, I know you've raised money in China, but you've chosen to focus really more your production and your activity outside of China and more. Tell us about that.
Yeah, my goal is to put a Chinese lead in mainstream Hollywood, with being female lead, not just I'm a feminist, I'm not, but I really feel that the stories about a strong Chinese woman or Asian woman needs to be told. And we just heard from Stella, her story is incredible, and there are many, many people like Stella that I would like to tell their story. And most of the stories that we created are really it's not just the Chinese story, but it's Chinese, it's American, it's about human stories. It's the stories that I myself would like to watch, and that I feel like in Hollywood we'd be missing those because all the studios are making tentpole movies, and the Chinese are, of course, making the type of movies that it's not gonna translate globally. So I'm hoping with my experience and my husband's writing, which, by the way, he's got several awards. Half of our scripts have got some kind of award. So I'm hoping I can bring those stories that have not been told by other studios through our indie production, bring it to the world so people can enjoy. And it's organic story because a lot of them is based on our own life. One of our scripts is called Parent Management. It's inspired by my sister, who is a Chinese tiger mom, bringing her children up in America, and her children are American. They're born in this country, and their classmates are all from all over the world, not just China. And these new young American, how they're facing the world how they live their life. So even though the lead character is a young teenager, she is fighting back her tiger mom. So there's not just the cultural conflicts between the mother and the daughter, and there's also conflicts among children of different background, and that's the new America, I think, the new landscape of this country. And I have a TV show which came in also a top contender in the UCLA contest, the last the 2014 and 2015. And it's about a young Chinese woman building her startup in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is where we spent many years, so we know the ins and outs, the VCs, how the startup world work. And also being a young female character, there are many of them in Silicon Valley that are building their startups. So it's all based on true stories and true lives of people, and then it just got dramatized for the market. So that's where I'm at.
Thanks, Jean. We have about 3 or 4 minutes. I don't know, are we set up? Can we take some questions from the audience? No? Okay. So why don't I ask one last question then of the panelists. I asked them to think about this. You know, there's a lot that's obvious about China. It's a big growth story. It's as Mike said, it's going to be the most important entertainment territory for Hollywood. So apart from that, are there any sort of counterintuitive, half-crazy predictions that you have for the U.S.-China relationship?
Well, I would say that if we're talking about theatrical feature films that intend for an American release, China is not going to be driving your production strategy. That it's going to continue to be driven by the need to be a major release here. If you are a major release in the North American market and can qualify under their quota systems, then you will enjoy success in China. I think that although the Chinese box office will equal the U.S. box office soon and will exceed it in just a few years, it's not going to be a huge multiple of the U.S. box office. There are penetration issues with respect to how far the multiplex theater building will go. There are disposable income issues, distribution costs in so vast a country. So I have seen predictions that it will be 2 times or 3 times the U.S. box office, and I don't think that would occur.
I might make a prediction based on that a little bit. I'm not going to disagree with anything that he said there. The one thing I will say is that I predict that with specific movies, I would say maybe 10 movies a year that have massive potential in China, that we're going to actually start to see studios try to find out when those movies might be releasable in China and actually day and date those movies based on the China release date rather than the U.S. release date. That's my big prediction.
I wanted to add one thing to that as well, in that I think that the quota, I think you mentioned the quotas. I think the quotas are going to relax. I don't think this is a huge, surprise to anybody. I do believe that while the U.S. may drive kind of the studio tentpole business, because we are firmly rooted in, we're making those movies in between the smaller independents and the studios in that 15 to 35 range. Those are being driven, I think, in large part by the international market. And the U.S. now has become 10, 20% of what we expect out of those movies, while China ends up being 50, 60% of what we expect. So for the independent space, I think China, for us at least, it is the driving. We're making movies for China and that work internationally, but not really the other way around. So I think a combination of that, as well as I think a major relaxation of the quotas. I think they're going to start letting more and more films in, and soon, it will find its own level between the international landscape.
Okay, being mindful of our schedule, we need to wrap it up. I want to again thank all of our very distinguished panelists. Thank you for the really interesting comments that you've made. Thank you to the audience for listening to us, and Rebecca for having us here.